Welcome to this week's episode of Seeking Proof, Finding Grace. I'm your host, Ron Campbell, and this week, as with every week, I want to start off by reminding you of the most important truth in the entire universe. God loves you. I hope you've been enjoying the episodes that we've been going through here lately, talking about the problems with Darwin's theory of random mutation and natural selection, neo-Darwinian theory, as we talk about the problems that evolution has, explaining how we got here. This week, we're going to look at one of the best examples of one of those problems. Last week we talked about the systems inside of our body. And I mentioned that we were going to save the reproductive system for this week's episode to talk about the unique problems that the reproductive system causes for Darwin's theory. So let's talk about that for a minute and kind of walk through this, because the reproductive system, let's be honest, sex is a big issue. It's all we ever seem to talk about in our culture, and it's going to be problematic, not only for our culture, but for Darwin as well, as we see the issues that this is going to cause to Darwin's theory. Last week, we talked about the other systems that we have in our body, and this week, I wanted to leave the reproductive system out because its unique problems that it poses are going to be a deal breaker for Darwin. And we recognize this, I think, when we take a step back and look at how we got here. We'll go light on the birds and bees aspects of tonight's episode for the kids who might be tuning in. But the reality that we have is when we think about how we get here, and this is true for nearly every animal species on the planet, it requires a male and a female coming together in just the right way to produce an offspring. And the process, while very straightforward, can also be highly problematic. There are lots of couples who struggle out there to be able to have kids, who want to be able to have kids. And the problem is you've got a lot of internal working parts on both the male and the female that have to work correctly. And if they don't all come together in just the right way at just the right time, then you have a problem on your hands. That problem that we can clearly see is going to be a deal breaker for Darwin's theory. And I want you to think about this as we walk through it, because in the episodes that we've been talking about before, the problem has been isolated to just inside of us. It's just within us that we look at and we see the issue. But if we go back and we follow Darwin's theory to its logical conclusion, at some point in our distant past, you had to have an ancestor who was capable of self-reproduction without requiring a partner. We know this from the first cell. We talked about that episodes ago, talking about that we seem to be going in the wrong direction, that we seem to be growing increasingly complex as we move forward. And while we're able to do more with that complexity from an evolutionary standpoint, the direction we're going doesn't necessarily make sense. So when you look back in our distant history, if we follow neo-Darwinian theory back to its logical conclusion, at some point, it was just a single individual entity. And that entity was able to replicate itself without requiring a partner. That has tremendous advantages for any species, because if one entity can reproduce itself without needing another partner, that simplifies things dramatically. Gets rid of the dating scene altogether. You just skip to the end, I suppose, at that point. But when you look at that, at some point there's going to be this division into a male and a female. And I want you to think about our bodies and all of the very complex parts that we have inside of our bodies. We have eggs and sperm and all of the complex things that it takes within the female body to be able to care for and carry that baby during the gestation process, going from the initial fertilization, the initial creation of life, all the way forward to where the child is born. You have all of these incredibly complex working parts. Now, here's going to be the issue that we're going to have. Is it impossible to say that any complex working system like that couldn't be simplified as we go forward? And there's no question, I think it can be simplified to varying degrees. But the problem that you're going to have is, at some point in the distant past, all of those complex working internal organs, all of those complex internal working parts were contained within a single creature who had the ability to reproduce all on its own without requiring a partner. At some point, that splits into a male and female, right? When you do that, you have a split of the working parts. That's going to be incredibly difficult on its own. So the internal working parts are divided between the male and the female of the species, and each one brings something to the table. You've got a massive mutation at that point, and this is going to be where neo-Darwinian believers are going to say, well, that's going to be the random mutation piece of this. It was all functioning inside of one creature, and you have a massive mutation where it then splits part into one creature, part in another. So what they would have us envision might be, let's say you have the creature that could reproduce all on its own is pregnant with twins. But within the twins, they split. And one twin gets the male parts and one twin gets the female parts. And when those twins are born, you have the first generation of male and female that will ultimately need to come together to keep that genetic mutation, that improvement in the species alive. Now, maybe we can imagine all of that. And I'm going to argue that that process, again, genetic mutation, is going to leave that process broken in the vast percent of the time. I can't imagine what the numbers would be if you ran statistically how unlikely it is that you could have a genetic mutation that would split a perfectly functioning being that was able to self-reproduce all on its own into two beings, one male, one female, that could then come together to reproduce together. But it's one shot, right? You get one shot at it, and if it breaks in the process, which it's likely to do, but let's say miraculously it doesn't, you get one shot to separate the male from the female. What's missing in this equation? You have the internal working parts. What's missing in this equation is the external interfaces, those things that we cannot show on a PG-rated podcast. The external interfaces are going to be needed so that the male and the female can come together and engage the internal working parts. How does that happen? Because you got one working shot at this. Remember, if you've divided up the male and the female in one shot, and you have a male and a female, but they're unable to come together and reproduce, why would they carry forward in future generations as male and female? They wouldn't be able to reproduce, the male reproducing the male and the female reproducing female, or vice versa, in any aspect of it. They can't do anything without the external interfaces, without the ability for the male and the female to come back together. Why would the external interfaces have been evolving prior to the separation of the one being into the male and female? Why would you have been evolving all of those external working body parts that we cannot show on a PG podcast? The external parts are very necessary to make the connection for the internal parts to work. How do you do that in one generation? Are we really to believe that the mutation that occurred was not only a separation of the internal working parts into a male and a female, but at the exact same time, the necessary external working interfaces between the two to allow for the male and female to come together? How does that happen? And I will contend there is no possible explanatory vehicle to get you down that process, because you have to do it in one generation. Otherwise, the mutation that gives you the male and female cannot possibly reproduce to the next generation without the internal and external working parts. And this is going to be an absolute deal breaker for Darwin. I can't possibly come up with a method. I can't possibly come up with a pathway to get us there where you can get the external and internal working parts to all evolve simultaneously to carry the mutation forward in such a way that the split from single unisex to male and female can survive and carry forward. And not only is it carried forward in any generation, it's carried in any species, it's carried forward in every species nearly. How does that happen? How can you possibly get there? And again, this is one of these things we're just supposed to take for granted. But let's turn this question around. What is it, when we look at the problem of reproduction, what is it that does have good explanatory power? Let me suggest to you an alternative. The alternative being that when you look at the division from a unisex creature able to reproduce on its own to male and female, that you fundamentally change the entire process from being something that is simply a biological function to something that brings together the male and the female in a genuinely unique way, almost like it was designed that way. When you think about the most important thing that we have as a species of moving forward into the future, of continuing the human race or any other species in general, when you look at the relationships that males and females have within all of the species, the process of reproduction takes center stage in a lot of different aspects of life. And when you look at that, it dramatically changes the dynamic of the relationship between the male and the female, especially when you look at us. And that's what we're looking at here is us. How much different would this world be if males and females didn't need each other? If there was one single sex, and that one single sex was able just to reproduce? Think about all the things that you would lose. Think about how special children are and the unique creation that we have when a male and a female come together and you bring together all of that DNA and all of those different parts, the sperm and the egg and everything else, that produces a baby that is a little bit of mom and a little bit of dad. And we always like to think the best parts of both. But when you think about so many parts of Darwin's theory, natural selection only happens because the male and the female coming together, and it allows this opportunity for genetically inherited traits to move forward. But if it was simply unisex, all you would have would be genetic mutation. Random selection, natural selection, while it would still exist, would be dramatically curtailed as a force in this process. So ironically, Darwin, for his theory to work, for natural selection to have the power that he sees that it has, natural selection needs this idea of male and the female coming together. And the male and the female coming together is so inherently complex and inexplicable by his own theory. The thing that his theory needs to move natural selection forward is undone by one of the key component parts to how it all works. But if we take it in context of a creator, and we think about the introduction of relationship into the process, which everything we've been talking about this whole time, whenever I've taken a break and we've talked about Christmas or we've talked about Easter, and we've talked about what is God after? God is after a relationship with us. And we see a microcosm of this in our relationship with each other and our relationship with our children, of what we see around us as we reproduce and we do these things. Is it possible that the reproductive cycle was purposely put together by an intelligent third party? Now, I'm going to stop right there for a minute. That the reproductive system was put together by an intelligent third party is the best explanation for what we observe in the reproductive system. I don't think there's any question. It has the concept of intelligent design as it relates to the reproductive system is hands down the best explanation when compared to the neo-Darwinian alternative, no question. But if we take it a step further and we say it also shows us the fingerprint of the creator, because by splitting the species into male and female, he creates a unique relationship that has to exist between the human male and the human female. And that relationship shapes our society, it shapes our culture, it shapes everything as we go forward. And that relationship and that unique combination of reproduction between a male and a female that produces one of the most amazing miracles we have, which are children, when we look at all of that, it's not just a biological function, it's a gift beyond measure. So not only does an intelligent creator far, far outpace neo-Darwinian evolution as the best explanation for what we observe with the reproductive system, it also gives us an insight as to some of what that creator's purpose was when we look at us. That is why this is so special, and that is why I wanted to call this one out as a separate episode to talk about it before we wrapped up this portion of the series. So again, short podcast tonight. I didn't want to carry this on too long tonight. I think this is very evident and straightforward. Next week, we're going to talk about an example. Let's say you've got all these working body parts. How is it that we go from one animal to the next? We're all supposed to be evolved from a single ancestor. Next week, we're going to talk about the problem of evolving from one ancestor, from one species into the next, and how impossible that actually is. I want to thank you, though, for joining us this week. I hope you liked the podcast, and if you did, I hope you'll consider hitting the like button for the podcast and the like button for the episode and the subscribe button for the podcast. You can find our website at proof2grace.com. You can reach out to us via email at proof2grace@yahoo.com if you've got any questions. And you can find our podcasts on YouTube, iTunes, and Spotify. I hope you enjoyed the podcast, and I hope to see you next time. Thank you so much for joining us. Bye-bye.